Hey guys, Gare here, and I have a question for you. Who else loves literary biographies the way I do? I've enjoyed reading about writers that I love all my life. I've read writer biographies ever since I was a kid, and I'm aware that there are a lot of good readers out there um, who enjoy certain authors, and they kind of know the basics of who they are and what their life is about and all that, but they're not terribly into discovering who they are as people or what their life is, or they're not seeking them out at book signings or necessarily following them on social media. I'm totally the opposite. If I'm and there are some writers I'm more curious about than others, but um, generally speaking, if it's a writer that I really love and really enjoy, I want to know more about them. I want to know who they are, what made them, what brought them to the place where they wrote this particular book, especially if it's a great book. So I've got several books. This is really a big topic for me. There's probably going to be a series of videos on literary biographies, memoirs, letters, journals, in the future. I've got stacks and stacks of books like this, and so, hopefully you're looking forward to numerous videos on this topic from me in the future. But I'm going to talk about a few today, and a couple of different aspects of literary biography and memoirs, and I hope you enjoy it. A book that I've actually spoken of before and highly recommend, and I highly recommend all of these books, but as a matter of fact, a video that I did for on YouTube several years ago, which is one of my most watched videos, is called The Secret Comic Book History of Patricia Highsmith, and in it I reference this biography of Highsmith written by, it's a very large, wonderful book. One of the best literary biographies I've ever read, of Highsmith by Joan Didion. You can see this video, just type in the secret comic book history of Patricia Highsmith, and there it'll pop up. But of course, this is Highsmith's. This is a very comprehensive look at Highsmith's entire life. And what was so interesting about this book was its approach to it was a non-linear, non-traditional biography. Most standard biographies will, start with, the ancestors of the author, and then their parents, and then their birth and their upbringing, and, as they move their way through life and how they became writers and what their writing life was like. Shankar does an interesting thing in this book. There is a trajectory. She moves through Highsmith's life and her progress as as a person and a writer, but she kind of goes back and forth in her narrative. She'll go to Highsmith's future when she's kind of writing about her in her 20s, and when she's older, she'll reference back to when she was younger, and that might not seem like it would work, but she makes it work quite well. And I highly recommend this book, The Talented Miss Highsmith by Joan Didion. By all means, and Highsmith, of course, was the author of The Talented Mr. Ripley and Strangers on a Train and many, many other very fine books, and quite a fascinating figure. So, there is that one. I would reference it again. We're going to see the name Hermione Lee a couple of times in this video, the first being with her wonderful biography of Edith Wharton, another favorite writer of mine. Again, a massive, a very well done, more traditional biography, and very comprehensive. Lee is, of course, one of the great biographers autobiographies. She's done several, and they're all superb. I mean, you can pick up any of them, and read them, and you'll be quite happy with them. So, especially if you're a Wharton fan like me, I highly recommend her book on Edith Wharton. And I recommend Edith Wharton, of course. Also, Lee wrote her wonderful book, and I have more than one edition of this, but this is my kind of wrecked paperback of Hermione Lee's book on Virginia Woolf. Again, large, comprehensive, pretty traditional biography of Virginia Woolf. Superb book. Really, really wonderful, superb book. Highly recommended. By all means, read this on Virginia Woolf. And again, read Virginia Woolf, of course. How many of you are fans of John Cheever? I've liked Cheever as far back as I can remember. Seems like Cheever is not much talked about nowadays, which makes me sad. He did write a handful of novels, but he was primarily I think we primarily know John Cheever now as a short story writer. And this is actually the collected letters of John Cheever. After Cheever passed in the 80s, over the years there's been quite a scholarship of biographies on him, memoirs written by members of his family. His daughter wrote a very good book about him. His journals, which I'll show in a future video, are quite good, quite interesting. So, letters are like another form of memoirs. Of course, nowadays, kind of puts a question mark in my mind, because nowadays, of course, we're not writing letters quite the way that we used to, are we? And so I'm wondering, do you save your emails? Do the writers out there, do you save your emails for posterity? Do you copy them out? Do you file them away? Are emails the same? Will we be reading the emails as authors in the future the way that we do the letters of writers of the past? I wonder about that. The superb letters of John Cheever. By all means, check it out. And this was actually edited by his son, Benjamin Cheever. So, the family has been involved in the retrospectives of Cheever's life, as well as, he said, other biographers. Another great writer that I admire very much, and Henry James. Henry James, A Life by Leon Edel. Edel is famous for writing over a very long period of time several books, several individual, very comprehensive, very marvelous books about the life of Henry James at different stages of his life. This is actually a condensed version of Edel's books, and I actually haven't read this. I've read the several versions, which I have here somewhere. I'm doing like a big rearranging of my books and personal things, and it's been kind of an ongoing project with me for quite a while, and I'll show them in a future video. But I'm interested in reading this because I'm interested in seeing how he condensed those books. I can't remember if there's 4 of them or 5 of them. There's several books that he wrote on Henry James's life, and of course, James is a fascinating figure. One of the great novelists, and whose life has taken on an added interest, maybe in the last 15 years or so, with newer biographies, and of course with the quote-unquote queering of Henry James. That a new scholarship has emerged. Colm Tobin's novel about James the Master, a superb book. I highly recommend it as well. I've got it. I'll show it in a future video and talk about it. And so, Henry James, read about his life. fascinating writer and figure. Also, sometimes, of course, writers write their own story. They write uh, biographies, they write memoirs, they write autobiographies, and sometimes writers write books that are about not so much, an overview of their life, but to write about one particular period or aspect of their life. Maybe they were going through something, a difficult period in their life, and which is an example in some of these books, and they they want to share their experience. I'm trying to finish up a memoir of my childhood, and finding it, the book is like 95% written, and finding it difficult to just get through that last 5% for some reason. It's very, very interesting. But I'm working on that. Author Joan Didion, another great writer, wrote The Year of Magical Thinking. This came out in, I believe it was 2005, I think. And Didion had written about the loss of her husband, the wonderful writer. He was a writer as well, John Gregory Dunn. And they had been married for decades. And he had had illnesses, had been sick, but his death was quite sudden. And this is just really a superb book. Magical thinking, of course, being the thinking that she talks about. It's very eloquent, very well written book. There's a part where she talks about, when she's finally letting go of his things, and she can't get rid of his shoes. The magical thinking is that, he might come back and he'll need these shoes. That period you go through when you're in deep grief and denial, and just really need to hang on to things. We've all had periods of loss, and those personal effects just take on, a new gravity, a new meaning, and takes a while to let things go. But really superb book. And the very sad thing was, actually at the time that when he died, the Didion and Dunn's daughter, Quintana, was seriously ill. And she actually died but literally just a few weeks before this book was published. And then several years later, Didion wrote a memoir of losing her daughter called Blue Nights, which is another very fine book. So, two very beautiful books, very well written memoirs about loss. And there's a category of, there are books where writers, and it seems like it's mostly female writers, who will write about widowhood. Joyce Carol Oates, and I'll show it again in a future video, wrote a memoir about losing her husband of almost 50 years. And other authors have written about losing their spouse. You don't see that a whole lot from male writers. I think Julian Barnes wrote a book about losing his wife. But Joan Didion, The Year of Magical Thinking, terrific book on the death of her husband, and some about their life together. A great book that I read last year. I actually got an advanced reader copy. Thank you very much, Ayelet Waldman. This is A Really Good Day. A Really Good Day was Ayelet Waldman's book. It's her memoir of her account of experimenting with LSD. And the reason that she did this for a brief period is because she was dealing with very severe depression and anxiety, and she had gotten information that LSD in very teeny microdoses, very carefully administered, could help with this, could give you long-term help. And the book is an account of that, and it helped her enormously. And this is, it might sound like a strange book, but this is actually, you might know Waldman. Waldman is married to the author Michael Chabon. Um, and she's a wonderful novelist and essay writer, and I highly recommend that you seek her books out. And I really wish this had gotten more attention than it did. It was one of the best books I read last year. It might sound like a downer, like it's very heavy, and it has periods like that where, you know, she's talking about her problems, and because she was really going through she was quite desperate, you know, whenever she undertook this experiment, and which helped her. And the book is actually quite funny. There are places in it where, you know, I laugh out loud, and where she's just recounting, especially early on, like when she's talking about, you know, the various things she tried to do to get help, and, you know, the results just being kind of laughable. So, you know, very good book, very much well worth reading. A Really Good Day, Ayelet Waldman, LSD. So, quite an interesting book. Do seek it out. Another aspect of a writer's life, my beloved friend Anne Rice wrote her memoir called Out of Darkness. This came out about 10, 12 years ago. And this is Rice's account of basically going back to the church, and just gave me a beautiful inscription on this. This was 2008, so this has been 10 years ago. And I don't know if you can see it, but Rice had left the church as a very young woman, losing her faith, the Catholic Church, and pretty much lived her life as agnostic or atheist for decades, and gradually came back to the church in the 90s. If you were reading Anne Rice there's always been a strong spiritual component in her books, and still is, of course. And you could kind of see from the mid-90s on, and you saw it in books like Memnoch the Devil, where these big questions were asked about spirituality and life and beyond, and what does it all mean? But this is basically about her experience with religion and her personal faith and her journey along the way, which has changed, since she wrote the book. After she wrote the book, she came several years afterwards, she became quite disgusted with the church's stand on things like gay marriage and things and other subjects, and she left the church. Still a believer, but excuse me, still a believer, but not a member of the church. And it's an excellent book. Again, on a specific aspect of a person's life, not a full biography or memoir at all. I wish you would write one. I think that would be terrific. Final book that I'm going to share with you is one I really like a lot, and I wonder how many of you are familiar with the late author Lee Israel. Lee Israel. Does it ring a bell? Israel wrote some biographies of famous people in the 1970s and 80s. She wrote a book about Tallulah Bankhead. She wrote a very well-received book on, I can't remember, who was it, Dorothy, the lady she wrote the book about, who was on the game show, and she was a very famous journalist and died under mysterious circumstances, and her name I could Google it, but she was a very successful author in the 70s and in the 80s, but she had a failure with a book that she wrote on, I believe it was Estee Lauder, and the book did not do well. And then, her fortunes began to change. She had some personal crises. fell into some financial woes, and resulted, I believe this takes place in the early mid-90s if I remember correctly, the book is called Can You Ever Forgive Me? Memoirs of a Literary Forger. And Israel fell upon hard times and began forging letters, signatures of famous writers, people like Dorothy Parker, Noel Coward, among others, and for a while was quite successful in it, and basically survived through forgery. And this is a very short book, but it's extremely well written account. She did eventually get caught and have to go to court, and she came out on the other side of it. But it's really and she's quite honest about it. She doesn't really make excuses. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She was in just terror of being found out. Probably you kind of have the feeling as you're reading, she knew she would be found out eventually, which she was, and got into trouble. I remember reading this and thinking this would make a really terrific movie, like with an older actress, and I think now finally a movie is being made, and it's Melissa, not such an older actress, Melissa McCarthy, I believe, is playing Israel, so I'm really looking forward to that, and I hope they do a good job on it. But Can You Ever Forgive Me? Leah Israel, her account of her life in forgery. So, it has a lot of funny aspects about it. It's not like a down and out, not turn to crime. Well, it is that, but it's actually very entertaining, very thoughtful, and quite funny in places. A very interesting book. She's quite candid, and there's kind of like a little gimmick they did on the back of it with the author blurbs. You have forged blurbs. They thought that would be Groucho Marx. The sole virtue of Leah Israel's memoir is its brevity. Groucho Marx didn't say anything about this book. No Coward. I received the bound galleys here at my chateau in neutral Switzerland, which I've always maintained could do with a small war. Her faux letters imputed to me, they're not even no coward manky, but a tacky, vulgar drag act, and so forth. And there's supposed to be a quote here from Katharine Hepburn, But it's a lot of fun, very interesting. So, Can You Ever Forgive Me? Do check that out. So, for some traditional memoirs, biographies, some letters, what authors do you recommend biographies of? What writers do you like reading about? Maybe you come to same writers over and over again in different memoirs over the years, and biographies and autobiographies, letters, journals, etc. So I hope you enjoyed that Booktube video, and I will be doing more of these in the future, as well as other book videos, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching, and by all means, do share with me in the comments the literary memoirs that you recommend. Thanks a lot.